And the first thing I noticed, coming round what I call the skirting in the upstairs lounge cabin area, where the air conditioning air comes in, it was billowing in smoke. I mean, I might not be able to smell much, but I could smell this rather acrid electrical burning smell, and it was very characteristic of how the tubes in London smelt in those days. It's not like it now, because they've obviously used different brake linings up there or something, but this was characteristic of that. But I went on the flight deck expecting them to say, we've got a fire or smoke in the electronics bay, should we fire the fire extinguisher? But nothing was further from that at all. I went in and they said, come and look at this, it's beautiful. And they were watching on the windscreen a wonderful display of St Elmo's fire. Now, I've seen St Elmo's many, many times in my career in all sorts of places. On the ground at London, in the fog, up in the air. But St Elmo's is quite an attractive thing to watch. And it can manifest as just shimmering lights up and down the windscreen. But on this occasion, it developed into short lightning dashing up and down the windscreen. And it was multicoloured, which it isn't normally. There were all sorts of colours around. And it was, so they were watching the wonderful display. And as I'm sitting down, you know, you're doing everything you can to look to catch up. And I'm watching this wonderful display as well. And that's when it all started. And the flight engineer says, engine failure, number 4 engine. And it wasn't like a normal engine failure, because in the 4 or 5 years I was a first officer when these engines were bad, I'd had 23 engine failures, of which 18 had been catastrophic, gone for the big bang. So I thought I knew what an engine failure was like. But it's nothing like that. This thing was just winding down slowly. And you had to convince yourself it was running down. I mean, he was on it like a shark. He was very, very clever. He was a training engineer. He was bloody clever at picking out a Duff engine. I sat there watching it as the first officer, and it wasn't until we started to yaw slightly, because obviously 2 engines going on one side or the other, we're going to yaw. And the ball on the turn and bank thing goes out to one side, you know that you're in fact skidding. So I put some rudder in and kicked it up, and that's how it all started. We shut down engine number 4. We shut it down. We shut it down properly as though it was on fire, as we always did.
So that was your assumption at the time, was? Well,
no, he said it had failed. But everything else happened very quickly after that. Within 30 seconds, all 4 had shut down. They'd all 4 run down.
So how does he react to that? He's a trainee.
Yeah, and he says he's a training first captain, training engineer, and he said, well, number 2's gone, number 3's gone, and something like, oh goodness me, we've lost a lot. But under stress, one's vocabulary does become quite limited, you know. It's not easy not to swear.
Well, I think you'd be forgiven for swearing in that situation. And it's obviously unravelling very fast in front of you.
Oh, it was. It all happened within 30 seconds, that happened.
Yeah, I'm picturing this scene where you've got a bit of smoke, then you're watching this beautiful display of St Elmo's fire, and then suddenly all the engines have gone, and that's happened within 30 seconds.
Yeah.
What then?
Well, we're the proud possessors of the world's heaviest and largest glider.
That's still a Guinness World Record?
Well, it went in there, and I don't know, I've not seen anybody beat it, but they don't repeat these things. I think if something is difficult to beat, they don't keep it going. If they don't want anybody to do it, do they?
And it wasn't intentional.
No, it certainly was not.
And so, Eric, you're the captain, the decision maker. Really, you're trying to assess this situation. You didn't know what was causing this.
We had absolutely, utterly no idea what's going on. It's dark, it's black, there's no moon. Mir had a star, but there is no moon. So we don't know what's happened. All the engines have stopped. They don't do that.
And training up to this date would dictate?
Well, luckily, BOAC, in their wisdom from the early days of the Jumbo, from the beginning of the Jumbo, had practiced a 4-engine failure drill. It was in the air. I think it was done tongue-in-cheek, but we used to do it once every so often in the simulator as part of the annual checks and things that you do. It would come up maybe once every 2 years. And they're doing it more regularly now, I think, still.
I'm sure.
But, I'll be honest with you, it was nothing like the simulator, the real thing. Because things we were told would happen didn't happen, and things we were told wouldn't happen did happen. It's very confusing.
Yeah, sorry, just interested to know what an example of that would be. What were you expecting to happen that didn't?
There were all sorts of things, like we were told the first thing that would happen, because there would be a complete power failure, which there wasn't, would be that the autopilot would drop out. And if the autopilot drops out on one of those Jumbos, the klaxon would go off so loudly you couldn't hear yourself talk or think. This thing would go, very, very loudly. And that didn't happen. The autopilot stayed in. So, if you're a logical sort of a person, that's very confusing. All the engines have stopped. We look across on the engineer's panel, and there was a total electrical failure indicated. There was on the panel, yet the autopilot had stayed in. There were lights coming on and going off that weren't supposed to, and were supposed to. It's hard. 40 years later, it's hard to remember exactly, and I'm sure I'm missing things out. But the big thing to me was the autopilot stayed in, and so I thought to myself, well, don't be a bloody idiot. Use it. And that gave us an extra pair of hands. That was great. For the first few thousand feet of descent, I used that. I used it to turn off the airway. Because we're going to descend, unscheduled descent, you don't want to keep going straight ahead, because if something's coming the other way, down lower, 10 to 1 you'd hit it. So I turned off the airway with the heading knob, and I wound in a descent to keep the thing at flying speed. And we had to fly between 250 and 270 knots indicated. I knew that. So I made sure I was doing enough descent to keep the speed at 250, 270.
But at the same time, if you've got no power, you know that there's only a limited amount of time that you can be doing that.
Yeah, but it's not a panic situation. I'm sorry.
So you weren't panicking at the time?
No, because you've got 37,000 feet of altitude before you hit cumulogranite, or depending how high the cumulogranite is. But I knew I was 29,000 feet, and I was coming down at probably 1,800 feet a minute. And
I'm conscious not to put like a Hollywood spin on it, but for me, it's picturing an aircraft that has lost all its engines, and it's a 747, and it's got passengers on board.
Yeah, but what you forget is the only 4 inches of flesh on that aeroplane I'm concerned about is that. They're the most valuable 4 inches of flesh in the world, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, so you can discard the rest of it.
So it's just you,
me,
fight or flight.
Yeah,
and you've through training. I imagine the previous 100 series engine failures maybe helped a bit. All your experience helps. I've been flying them for a few years. I was 41 years old. I was cross because if it had happened 2 weeks before, I'd only been 40 in the newspapers. But I was 41 years old then, and I had a few years of experience. But I didn't want that to happen, thank you. And it didn't. And did the situation ever turn? You said it wasn't a time to panic for you.
No.
But it was critical.
Absolutely, yeah.
And because it was happening so fast.
No, it wasn't. The glide down is quite slow. I mean, you can see we weren't expecting anything to happen above 30,000 feet because Rolls-Royce, and they were RB211s, Rolls-Royce had said, It's no point in trying to start these engines above 29,000 feet. They won't start. But we'd been encouraged and taught in training to try from the very word go, from the time of the top of descent. And we were at 37,000 feet and we started the procedure right away. So we did as we'd been trained. But on the simulator, when you do that and you get down to 30,000 feet, all of a sudden, as if magic, the engines all start up. It wasn't until we got to 30,000 feet that I'm sure a lot of it kicked in. We thought, bloody hell, that hasn't happened as it should. We weren't really in a panic mode until, I suppose, no, we didn't panic at all. But when you get to 30,000 feet or 29,000 feet and nothing happens, then you've got to start thinking a bit more about what you're going to do, because perhaps they won't start.
And at what stage do you think that kicked in? The plan B or contingency?
Well, I mean, we got down to, after the first couple of starts, I was thinking, and, I had a debate up in the training with the Jumbo, the first in 1970-71, over in Shannon. I had a debate or a chat over a pint of beer with the then chief training pilot. And I've always maintained you need to employ pilots that think. And of course, then the management think was, no. You want pilots that do things by rote. Because if they do things by the checklist all the time, you will get the least number of accidents. And they are speaking, because airlines now aren't run by people like me, aviators, practical aviators, they're run by accountants. And they think about the bottom line all the time. And I think they're wrong. I think you need pilots that think. So I started thinking straight away. And I thought to myself, we're daft. We're only trying to start 3 engines because we'd shut number 4 down fully. It would never start. We'd cut off the fuel and we switched off the ignition and everything. So I thought to myself, why don't we reinstate that engine and we've got 4 chances instead of 3? And so I said this to the other 2, and my first officer says, that's a bloody good idea, Eric. But the training engineer, because in the book it says you shouldn't do that, he said, no, you're not. I said, bugger the book. We're doing it. And that was quite relevant, because later on, that engine, the first one we shut down, was the least damaged. It was the first one to start. But we were down at 13,000 feet before that happened. Yeah. So it does pay to think, in my book. And you won't ever convince me it doesn't.
I'd have to agree, because I've... Yeah.
So I was thinking about it. I was thinking about what to do. I knew we were heading back towards Java, but I knew there was high ground along the west coast of Java, about 10,000 feet high, where all these volcanoes... I didn't think about bloody volcanoes at that stage, but I knew there were a lot there. 10,000 feet was probably the safety height. And I knew then we could come down to about 12,000 feet on that heading, and then we'd have to turn out back to sea, which would give us a little more glide if we hadn't started the engines. Yeah, but so I knew I'd planned out in my mind what I was going to do and where I was going to turn and things. And now all I had to do was execute what we were supposed to do, keep the thing flying. And the only way to keep it flying is to keep some height or airspeed, and our Father who art in heaven,
I'm sure many people did. But you make it sound like it was not a problem, more of an inconvenience.
Well, it was a bloody inconvenience, and I'm sure that thinking through it made me able to cope with it. I mean, we had no idea why those engines had stopped, and that was annoying me. Why didn't we know? And we didn't know. But you don't want a post-mortem in the air. You have the post-mortem when you're safely on the ground. The first thing I had to do was to get that aeroplane somehow back on the ground. And if we could, get the engine started. Because otherwise we were in the sea.
And you did, before we get to the ground, I did want to ask about your statement, your announcement.
Yeah. Well,
because you've got a kind of unofficial award of the understatement.
Yeah. Well, the fact is, I was trying to get the attention of my chief steward, because the intercom on the aeroplane, or the telephone system, wasn't working, and I didn't know if the passenger address was working. But I thought I'd have to take a chance, because I couldn't get in touch with him anywhere else. So I wanted to get the attention of my chief steward, and I got the attention of the world's press, I'm afraid. And they've dined out on it more than I have.
I was just.
Well, you're going to talk to 247 passengers, and there were 16 crew there as well. And I mean, I didn't know, but they knew that the engine stopped, because what I didn't know was my chief steward was on the flight deck when they all stopped. I didn't know that, but he'd been downstairs and told them all, but not the passengers. So if you've got 247 passengers, I think you could easily get a panicky mutiny if you said the wrong thing. So I thought to myself, you've got to sound as though you're very laid back and quite laconic, say something you normally say. And I've always been honest. I've always told people exactly why you're delayed with me or late. There's no point in the bunkum they tell you about, we've got to do this. So you've got to have an engine failure. Say you've got to have an engine change or something. Don't try to sweet talk them. No, you can't get through life like that in my book, because I'm a Hampshire boy, and I believe in telling it as it is. And so I thought, well, I'll say, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to Captain Eric Mooney again. We have a small problem in that all 4 engines have failed. We're doing our utmost to get them going. I trust you're not in too much distress. And the thing I wanted to get across was, would the chief steward please come to the flight deck? And if you fly on British Airways and you ever hear that, it's a good cause then to worry about where you're going to put down in the sea or on land, because that's a cue to the cabin crew to put stuff away and get ready for a ditching or a crash landing.
Fascinating. And I think even more so because you're dealing with the incident, but you've also been able to assess what you're going to say and to reassure people, really, which is it's done.
My wife often says, "Oh, well, you're a man, you can't do." Being a pilot, you have to be able to do 6 or 7 things at the same time, honestly, and do them well sometimes and cope.